February 1944. Somewhere over the North Sea, altitude 11,000 feet, the cold bit through riveted aluminum and leather gloves alike. Flight Officer Martin Hendricks held the control column of his P-47 Thunderbolt steady, eyes fixed on the fuel gauge. The needle trembled just above the red line. Behind him, spread across the sky in loose formation, 9 more fighters followed his lead back toward England. They had escorted the bombers deep into occupied Europe. Now they were alone. The math was simple, brutal, final. Range to target, 420 miles round trip. Maximum combat radius of the P-47D, 375 miles under optimal conditions. But conditions were never optimal. Headwinds, combat maneuvering, engine stress. Every sortie became a calculated gamble with gravity and the English Channel. Hendricks keyed his radio once. Red flight, sound off. 9 voices crackled back. 9 pilots. 9 fuel gauges all telling the same story. They would make it home. Barely, always barely. But 2 weeks ago, Red 7 had not made it home. Engine coughed out 40 miles from the coast. The pilot ditched in freezing water. Rescue boats found debris. They did not find the pilot. Before that, Blue 3 went down in farmland over Belgium. Fuel exhaustion, enemy territory. The pilot survived the crash and spent the rest of the war in a stalag. Hendricks watched the coastline emerge through broken clouds. White cliffs, green fields, safety. His fuel gauge read nearly empty. Every mission ended this way, every single one. The ground crews met them on the tarmac at RAF Debden, faces grim. They knew the numbers. They measured what came back in the tanks. Sometimes it was mere gallons, sometimes less. Hendricks climbed down from the cockpit and his legs felt heavier than usual, not from fatigue. From the weight of knowing that tomorrow, or the day after, the math would finally catch up. Across the airfield, near the maintenance hangars, a thin column of smoke rose from behind the enlisted men's mess. Someone was cooking something. The smell carried on the wind, sweet and chemical, wrong for any kitchen. Hendricks paid it no attention. He had a briefing in 20 minutes and a mission the next morning that would push them even deeper into Germany. 300 miles inland, round-trip distance, nearly 500 miles. Impossible with current fuel loads. But the bombers needed escort. The orders were clear, and so the pilots would go, because that was what they did. They would go, and some of them would not come back. The fuel problem was not new. It had been discussed at every level of command. Engineers worked on drop tanks, larger internal cells, more efficient engines. But solutions took time, and time was measured in lost aircraft and missing men. Hendricks walked toward the ready room, his flight jacket stiff with cold. Somewhere behind him, that strange smoke continued to rise, and the wind carried with it a smell like burning sugar mixed with solvent. He did not look back. The briefing room smelled of cigarette smoke and damp wool. 24 pilots sat in folding chairs, their faces pale under harsh electric light. On the wall, a map of Northern Europe bristled with red pins. Each pin marked a target. Each target lay farther than the last. Major Calloway stood beside the map, pointer in hand. He did not waste time. "Gentlemen, tomorrow's mission is Bremen, industrial complex, ball-bearing factories, high priority." He tapped the map. The distance was visible even from the back row. Escort range, 490 miles round trip. Weather permitting. Silence settled over the room like frost. Every pilot did the same calculation. Every pilot reached the same conclusion. Calloway continued as if he had not just assigned them an impossible task. "You'll carry 105-gallon drop tanks. Use them first. Maintain cruise RPM. Avoid unnecessary maneuvering." Someone in the third row muttered something. Calloway's eyes snapped toward the sound, but he said nothing. "Questions?" No one spoke. There were no questions because there were no answers. The meeting ended. The pilots filed out into the cold February night. Hendricks walked alongside his wingman, Lieutenant Peter Voss, a quiet man from Wisconsin who never complained and never joked. "We're not making it back from Bremen," Voss said. Hendricks said nothing. "Not all of us." "No." They reached the barracks and stood outside, breath fogging in the air. Across the field, a lone figure moved between the fuel trucks, carrying something heavy. He moved quickly, furtively, glancing over his shoulder. "Who's that?" Voss asked. "Don't know." They watched for a moment, then went inside. The figure was Staff Sergeant William Tennyson, and he was not supposed to be anywhere near the fuel depot at night. Tennyson was a cook, second shift, enlisted mess. He had joined the Army Air Forces in 1942 with dreams of flying, but his test scores and eyesight had landed him in the kitchen instead. He peeled potatoes, he stirred soup, he served food to men who risked their lives while he risked nothing. But Tennyson had grown up in rural Louisiana, where his father ran a small airstrip and rebuilt crop dusters in a tin hangar. Tennyson had learned to mix fuel by the time he was 12, ratios, additives, octane boosters made from whatever was available. He knew engines, he knew chemistry, and he had been listening. For weeks he had overheard the pilots talking, the fuel problem, the impossible missions, the empty tanks. He had watched crews paint kill markings on fuselages, and he had watched those same planes return with fuel gauges on zero. So Tennyson started experimenting. At first, it was only curiosity. He requisitioned materials under false pretenses. Cleaning supplies, industrial solvents, ethanol from the medical supplies, glycerin, methanol, compounds that, on their own, were harmless. But combined in precise ratios, they changed the properties of gasoline. He worked in the corner of the kitchen after hours, using beakers stolen from the base infirmary and scales borrowed from the supply depot. He tested small samples in glass jars, lighting them with matches, observing burn rates and residue. The science was sound. His father had done similar work with bootleg fuel during Prohibition. Tennyson simply adapted the principles. He created a fuel additive, a mixture of alcohol-based compounds and light hydrocarbon distillates that, when blended with standard 100-octane aviation gasoline, increased energy density by nearly 12%. It burned hotter, cleaner, and longer. On paper, it was brilliant. In practice, it was illegal. Modifying military fuel without authorization was a court-martial offense. Introducing unapproved substances into aircraft systems could cause catastrophic engine failure. If he was caught, Tennyson would spend the rest of the war in a military prison. But if it worked, Tennyson carried a 5-gallon drum toward the fuel trucks. Inside was his latest batch. He had refined the formula over 3 weeks, tested it in a salvaged engine block behind the motor pool. The results were undeniable. He reached the fuel truck parked farthest from the guard shack and checked the hatch. Unlocked. Maintenance had been careless. Tennyson climbed onto the truck's running board and opened the fuel cap. The sharp smell of aviation gasoline hit him immediately. He poured his mixture slowly, carefully, letting it blend with the existing fuel, 5 gallons into 800, a ratio of 1 to 160, enough to test. Not enough to cause suspicion. He sealed the cap, wiped down the surface, climbed down. No one had seen him. Tennyson walked back across the dark airfield, heart hammering, the empty drum tucked under his arm. Tomorrow, one of the planes would be fueled from that truck. The pilot would never know. The ground crew would never know. But if the fuel gauge read differently at the end of the mission, if the plane returned with reserves when it should have been empty, then Tennyson would know he was right. And if he was wrong, a pilot would die because of him. The mission launched at dawn. Hendricks and his flight climbed through overcast skies. Throttles open, engines roaring. The P-47 Thunderbolts formed up over the North Sea, 24 fighters in 4 flights of 6. Behind them, somewhere above the clouds, The heavy bombers droned toward Germany. Hendricks checked his gauges out of habit. Oil pressure, engine temperature, fuel. The needle sat just above full, the drop tank feeding first, as designed. They flew east. Below them, the coast of occupied Europe slid past. Farmland, rivers, roads stitched across the landscape like scars. Somewhere down there, people lived under the weight of war. Somewhere down there, soldiers waited for the sound of aircraft engines. The radio crackled. "Red leader, this is daybreak. Bogies at 2 o'clock. High." Hendricks scanned the sky, found them. 3 black specks, distant, circling. Red flight, stay tight. We hold position. The bombers were the priority. The fighters existed only to protect them. If the enemy engaged, they would respond, but they would not chase. The German fighters turned away. No contact. They crossed into Germany. Tennyson spent the morning in the mess hall, scrubbing pots and pretending to work. His mind was 300 miles away, over hostile territory, inside the cockpit of a plane fueled with his creation. He did not know which aircraft had received the modified fuel. The trucks rotated. The crews drew from random tanks. It could be any plane in the formation, or none at all. If the additive caused engine failure, the pilot would bail out or crash. Either way, Tennyson would be responsible. He imagined the investigation, the analysis of wreckage, the discovery of foreign compounds in the fuel system. They would trace it back. They always did. Tennyson scrubbed harder, hands red from scalding water. He had committed himself. There was no undoing what he had done. All he could do was wait. Over Bremen, the flak began. Black clouds erupted across the sky, each burst a shockwave of heat and shrapnel. The bombers pressed on, unloading their payloads, while the fighters circled above, watching for enemy interceptors. Hendricks felt the thunderbolt shudder as a blast detonated close. He banked left, keeping his flight together, eyes scanning every angle. Red 3, you still with me? Still here, lead. The bombers completed their run. The formation turned west. Time to go home. Hendricks checked his fuel. The drop tank was empty, long since jettisoned. Now he was running on internal tanks. The gauge read higher than expected. Not much, but enough to notice. He frowned. Perhaps he had miscalculated. Perhaps the winds were more favorable than forecasted. He keyed the radio. Red flight, fuel check. 9 voices responded with their numbers. Every one of them reported reserves above estimate. Hendricks said nothing. There would be time to analyze later. Now, they had to get home. They landed at Debden with fuel to spare. Not much, but more than usual. Enough that the ground crews noticed. "Sir," one mechanic said as Hendricks climbed down, "your bird came back with 6 gallons in the main. That's unusual." Hendricks looked at the fuel gauge, still visible through the open canopy. "Run a full diagnostic. Check for leaks or instrument error." "Yes, sir." Hendricks walked toward debriefing, troubled. Tennyson watched from a distance as the planes returned. He counted them, all 24. No losses. He wanted to feel relief. Instead, he felt only the tightening knot of fear. If the fuel had made a difference, someone would eventually notice. And when they did, they would ask questions. Tennyson returned to the kitchen and resumed his shift. That night, he went back to the fuel depot. He carried another drum. 3 missions later, the anomaly was undeniable. Hendricks sat in Major Calloway's office, staring at a spreadsheet of fuel consumption data. Beside him, Lieutenant Voss and 2 other flight leaders reviewed their own logs. Calloway tapped the paper with his pen. "Every plane in your flights has been returning with an average of 4 to 7 gallons more than projected, consistently, across multiple sorties." "Instrument error," one pilot suggested. "We checked, twice. The gauges are accurate. The fuel is real. Tailwinds. Meteorology says no. Conditions have been average." Hendricks leaned forward. "Then what changed?" Calloway looked at him. "That's what I want to know." He pulled out another document, a maintenance report. Ground crew flagged something else. Fuel drawn from Truck 17 has been testing slightly off-spec. Nothing dangerous, but the chemical composition is different. Different how? Higher energy content, trace amounts of methanol and glycerin. Silence. "Someone has been modifying our fuel," Calloway said. The weight of that statement settled over the room. "Sabotage?" Voss asked. "Possibly. Or—" Calloway hesitated. "Someone trying to help." The investigation began quietly. Military police interviewed ground crew, fuel handlers and maintenance staff. No one admitted anything. No one had seen anything unusual, but someone had been accessing the fuel depot at night. Security logs showed inconsistencies, locks left open, inventory discrepancies. Tennyson knew they were closing in. He considered stopping, destroying his remaining samples, disappearing into the anonymity of the enlisted ranks. But the numbers spoke for themselves. The pilots were coming home. More of them. More often. He could not stop. The breakthrough came when a sharp-eyed supply clerk noticed a pattern. Cleaning solvents and ethanol had been requisitioned by the same person. Small amounts, spread over weeks. Staff Sergeant William Tennyson. Kitchen staff. Calloway reviewed the report and made a decision. He did not call the military police. Instead, he walked to the enlisted mess at midnight and found Tennyson scrubbing a stove. "Sergeant," Tennyson turned, and his face went pale. "Walk with me." They walked outside, into the cold night. Across the airfield, a lone Thunderbolt sat under maintenance lights. Engine cowling open, Calloway stopped. He did not look at Tennyson. "You've been tampering with fuel." Tennyson said nothing. "I could have you arrested, court-martialed, imprisoned." Still silence. Calloway turned. His expression was unreadable. "Or you could explain to me exactly what you've been doing and why it's working." Tennyson met his eyes. And then, slowly, he began to talk. Within 2 weeks, Tennyson's fuel additive was being tested under controlled conditions by Army Air Force's engineers. They were skeptical at first. A cook with a homemade formula had no place in military aviation, but the data was irrefutable. Tennyson's mixture increased fuel efficiency by 12%. It did not damage engines. It did not degrade performance. It simply allowed the aircraft to fly farther on the same amount of gasoline. In March 1944, the formula was quietly approved for limited field use. No official announcement, no recognition. Just a brief memo authorizing ground crews to blend the additive into fuel supplies for long-range escort missions. The pilots never knew. They only knew that missions which once ended in empty tanks and crash landings now ended with reserves, margins, room for error. Hendricks flew his next sortie deep into Germany, escorting bombers to a target 450 miles from base. He expected to land on fumes. Instead, he returned with 10 gallons remaining, enough to go around again if needed, enough to save a life. Tennyson was never promoted. He was never decorated. His name appeared in no official reports. Major Calloway made sure of that. Recognition would have meant questions. Questions would have meant investigations. Investigations would have meant delays. Instead, Tennyson remained a cook. He returned to his shift, serving food to pilots who flew missions made possible by his work. He asked for nothing. He expected nothing. But sometimes, late at night, he stood at the edge of the airfield and watched the planes return. He counted them, all of them, and he knew. By the summer of 1944, Tennyson's additive had been refined and integrated into standard fuel production across multiple air bases in England. The official designation was Auxiliary Range Enhancement Compound Type 4, bureaucratic, forgettable. The results were not. Fighter range increased by an average of 50 miles. Long-range missions became feasible. Escort coverage deepened. Bomber losses decreased. The war did not end because of Tennyson's fuel, but it ended sooner, and more men came home. In June 1945, after VE Day, Hendricks found himself back at Debden, sorting through paperwork. The war in Europe was over. The base was emptying. Most personnel had already shipped out. In a dusty maintenance shed, he found a crate labeled Fuel Additive, Type 4, Authorized Use Only. He opened it. Inside were glass bottles filled with clear liquid, a faint chemical smell. On the lid, someone had scrawled in pencil, SGT-W Tennyson Kitchen. Hendricks stared at the name. A cook. He carried one of the bottles outside and stood on the empty tarmac, looking at the sky. Somewhere, a man who peeled potatoes and stirred soup had saved lives. Hendricks set the bottle down carefully, as if it was something sacred. Tennyson returned to Louisiana after the war. He never spoke of what he had done. He ran a small garage, fixing engines, mixing fuel for crop dusters. When asked about his service, he said only that he had worked in the kitchens. No one pressed him for details. In 1962, a historian researching wartime fuel logistics stumbled across a memo referencing Type 4 additive and its origins. He tracked the name, found Tennyson, wrote him a letter. Tennyson never replied. The historian published his findings in a minor journal. It was read by a few academics and forgotten by most. But the pilots who had flown those missions, the ones who had returned with fuel to spare when they should have crashed into the sea, they remembered something. They remembered coming home. They remembered the math that did not add up. They remembered the impossible made possible. And in the end, that was all that mattered. The last known sample of Tennyson's original formula was destroyed in a warehouse fire in 1958. No complete records survived. The exact ratios were lost. But the principle remained. Small changes, incremental improvements, quiet ingenuity. A cook who refused to accept that men had to die because the fuel ran out. A cook who decided to do something about it. History does not remember his name. The textbooks do not mention his work. But somewhere over the North Sea in February 1944, a pilot checked his fuel gauge and found enough to get home, and that was enough.